I discovered my son had taken my money to fund a vacation with his girlfriend. When I confronted him, he shrugged, laughed with his friends, and told me to relax, that I'd get over it. I warned him he wouldn't find what came next so easy. Days later, my phone was flooded with voicemails of him screaming and begging me to help him. Before I tell you how all that unfolded, take a moment to support this channel and leave a comment about where you're listening from. It helps stories like mine reach people who might need to hear them. I'm an old man now. I've lived long enough to believe I'd already seen the worst that family could do to each other. I was wrong. My name is Harold Whitman, and for most of my life, I believed being a good father meant staying quiet, being patient, and helping whenever I could. I raised my son, Lucas, after his mother passed away far too young. From the day I buried my wife, that boy became my whole world. I worked longer hours, skipped vacations, and told myself rest could wait. Lucas needed stability. Lucas needed opportunity. Lucas needed me, and I gave him everything I had. By the time he was grown, I was tired in a way that settles into your bones. I retired from Whitman Tool and Supply with a modest pension. Nothing fancy, but enough to live carefully. I downsized to a small house in Maplewood, Indiana. Quiet street. Same neighbors for years. A life that didn't ask much from me anymore. Lucas, on the other hand, was still finding his footing. He bounced between jobs at the Northline Distribution Center, complained about long hours, short paychecks, and how the world never seemed to give him a fair shot. I listened. I always listened. Sometimes I helped. Groceries here, gas money there, a little extra when rent came due. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd grow out of it. A few months before everything collapsed, Lucas started dating a girl named Brielle. She was loud where he was sullen, flashy where he was careless. I didn't dislike her outright, but something about her made my stomach tighten. She talked about vacations, parties, and living your best life, like money was an inconvenience other people were supposed to solve. Lucas brought her to the Oak Ridge estate for our family reunion that summer. Big house. Too many people. Too much noise. I watched them from the porch swing while they laughed with his friends. Phones always out, drinks always in hand. Lucas barely spoke to me that day unless he needed something. I didn't realize that would be the last normal moment we'd ever share. A week later, on a quiet Tuesday night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened my banking app. I needed to transfer money to cover a property tax bill. I remember squinting at the screen, thinking my eyes were finally failing me. The number didn't make sense. I refreshed it, then refreshed it again. My savings, nearly everything I put aside over the last 2 years, was almost gone. I felt a cold pressure in my chest, the kind that doesn't hurt at first, but steals your breath anyway. I called Heritage Trust Bank immediately. The woman on the line was polite, calm, professional. She told me there had been a large withdrawal made in person 3 days earlier. In person, using my identification. I told her there had to be a mistake. I hadn't left Maplewood all week. She paused, then asked a question that made my hand start to shake. Has anyone else had access to your ID or personal information, sir? Lucas knew my phone password. He'd helped me set up my banking app. I trusted him. I never imagined I'd need to protect myself from my own child. The withdrawal had been made at a branch across town, the same area where Lucas sometimes met his friends. I hung up the phone and sat there in silence for a long time. I tried to find excuses for him. Emergencies, confusion, some ridiculous misunderstanding that would make this hurt less. Then I checked social media. One of Lucas's friends, Connor Blake, had posted photos from San Isla Resort in Puerto Azul. Blue water, white sand, cocktails lined up on a table. And there was my son, arm around Brielle, smiling like the world owed him nothing but pleasure. The trip cost almost exactly what had disappeared from my account. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I felt something much worse. I felt foolish. When Lucas came home 2 days later, he didn't even look guilty. He walked into my living room like nothing had happened, tossed his keys on the table, told me the trip was amazing and that I should really travel more. I asked him where the money came from. He didn't deny it. He didn't even hesitate. He leaned back against the counter, glanced at his friends, and shrugged. "Relax, Dad. You'll get over it." His friends laughed. Something inside me cracked open and went quiet. I told him calmly that he had taken something he had no right to touch. That money was my security, my future, my last line of defense in a world that doesn't care about old men. He rolled his eyes. Brielle smirked. And Lucas said words I will never forget. "You don't even need it like we do." That was the moment I stopped being a safety net. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I simply told him to leave my house, and that he wouldn't enjoy what came next. They laughed again. At my age. At my shaking hands. At the idea that I could do anything at all. That night, after the house was empty, I sat alone in the dark and made a decision I should have made years earlier. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg. And I wasn't going to protect him from consequences anymore. I gathered every document I owned. Bank statements. Identification records. Withdrawal receipts. I drove to Pine Hollow Cabin before dawn, the place I used to go with my wife when we needed quiet. I slept there like a man preparing for a storm, because deep down I knew one was coming. And when it arrived, my son would finally understand that taking from me had cost him far more than money. I woke up at Pine Hollow Cabin just before sunrise, the kind of quiet you only find far from people who take more than they give. The air smelled like damp wood and pine needles, and for a moment, I let myself pretend this was just another fishing trip from years ago, when Lucas was still a boy and I could fix everything with a calm voice and a firm hand. That illusion didn't last long. Reality came back the moment I reached for my phone. 3 missed calls. All from Lucas. I didn't listen to the voicemails. Not yet. I knew the pattern too well. First anger, then denial, then excuses. I needed a clear head, not noise. Instead, I brewed coffee on the old stovetop and spread my papers across the table. Bank statements printed at the local library, handwritten notes about dates and times, screenshots of social media posts showing the vacation timeline. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I was documenting the truth. People think old men are slow. What they forget is that we've had decades to learn patience. Later that morning, I drove back into Maplewood and went straight to Heritage Trust Bank. I asked to speak to the branch manager. Her name was Susan Keller, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a voice that softened when she realized I wasn't there to yell. I explained everything calmly, that the withdrawal wasn't authorized, that my son had access to my information without permission, that the money had been used for personal travel. She listened carefully, fingers steepled, then sighed. "Because he used your identification and knew your credentials, this falls into unauthorized use rather than external fraud," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean you have no options." Options. That word carried weight. She explained the steps. Account freeze. Password changes. A new account number. A report filed with the bank's internal security team. And finally, the part she hesitated over. If you want to pursue recovery, you'll need to involve law enforcement or a civil attorney. I nodded. I'd already crossed a line where denial lived. There was no turning back. When I got home, Lucas's truck was parked in the driveway. So was Connor's car. I stayed in my vehicle for a full minute, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the familiar ache in my wrists. Then I got out. They were in my living room, feet on my coffee table, laughing over something on Connor's phone. Brielle wasn't there this time, but her presence still lingered, perfume in the air, entitlement in every corner. Lucas looked up. "There you are," he said casually. "We were wondering when you'd stop sulking." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I asked one question. "Do you understand what you've done?" He scoffed. "I told you, Dad. I'll pay you back. It's not like you're broke." Connor chuckled. "Yeah, man, you're acting like he robbed a bank." I looked at Connor, then back at my son. "You're both in my house," I said quietly, "and you're laughing about stealing from me." Lucas's face hardened. "Stop saying stealing. You're my father. That money was just sitting there." That sentence did something irreversible. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of the bank report, the account freeze confirmation, and a printed image of Lucas on that beach. Time-stamped. I've reported the withdrawal. I said, I've locked my accounts. And I've spoken to a lawyer. Connor stopped smiling. Lucas straightened. You wouldn't, he said. You're bluffing. I'm done protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. I replied, you have until the end of the week to return every dollar. Connor stood up slowly. This is getting weird, man. Then you should leave, I said, meeting his eyes. Connor didn't argue. He grabbed his jacket and went out the door without another word. Lucas stayed. He looked smaller without an audience. You're really going to do this to me? He asked. After everything? After everything, I said. He left in silence. That night, my phone rang again. And again. And again. I didn't answer. The first voicemail was angry. Accusations. Claims that I was overreacting. The second was defensive. Promises to pay me back soon. The third was different. It was fear. Dad, Lucas said, voice unsteady. We need to talk. Please. I didn't respond. The next morning, I met with Richard Monroe, a civil attorney recommended by Susan at the bank. He was blunt, which I appreciated. You can pursue recovery, he said, scanning the documents. But understand this. Once we start, you won't be able to control how far it goes. I thought of the laughter, the shrug, the words, you'll get over it. I already lost control when he decided my money wasn't mine anymore, I said. Richard nodded. Then we proceed. That afternoon, I filed a report. 3 days later, Lucas's friend stopped answering his calls. 5 days later, Brielle stopped posting photos. A week later, my phone rang at 2:17 a.m. This time, I answered. Dad, Lucas sobbed. Please. I didn't know it would go this far. His voice broke into something I'd never heard before. Panic. And for the first time since the night I checked my bank balance, I felt something settle inside me. Not joy. Not revenge. Clarity. Because my son was finally learning a lesson I should have taught him long ago. That taking from someone who loves you doesn't make you powerful. It makes you alone. By the time the third week rolled around, the town of Maplewood had started to feel smaller than it ever had before. Not because people were talking, at least not openly, but because silence has a way of closing in when something ugly is unfolding behind closed doors. I felt at the grocery store, in the post office line, even walking past neighbors who suddenly seemed unsure whether to wave. I didn't blame them. No one likes being near the center of a family fracture. Lucas called again the morning after that late-night voicemail. I let it ring, then again in the afternoon, then 3 more times before sunset. Each call felt heavier than the last. Not because I wanted to answer, but because I knew exactly what answering would do to me. It would soften me, and softness was what had put me here. Instead, I spent that day doing things I neglected for years. I cleaned out the garage, throwing away boxes of junk I kept just in case. I fixed a loose hinge on the back door. I sharpened old tools. Simple tasks. Honest tasks. The kind that reminded me I could still take care of my own life without anyone's permission. That evening, Richard Monroe called. Lucas contacted my office. He said, he's scared. I let out a slow breath. Good. Richard paused, then continued. He claims he didn't understand the seriousness of what he did. Says he thought it was family money. I almost laughed. Almost. That phrase again. I said, as if blood erases consent. There's more, Richard added. He wants to settle privately. No court. No report escalation. And the money? I asked. Partial repayment. A few $100s. I closed my eyes. Tell him no. Richard didn't argue. I will, but be prepared. When people realize charm won't save them, they try other tactics. He was right. 2 days later, Lucas showed up at my door unannounced. I saw him through the window first. He stood on the porch shifting his weight from foot to foot, hair unkempt, shoulders slumped. He looked tired, older. For a fleeting second, my chest tightened with something that felt like pity. Then I remembered the beach photos. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Dad," he said quickly, "please, just hear me out." "You can talk," I replied, "but you won't come inside." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. He launched into excuses first. Work stress, bad influence, how Brielle had pushed for the trip, how he'd planned to tell me after, how he'd meant to pay it back once things settled. I listened without interrupting. Then I spoke. "You didn't make one mistake," I said calmly. "You made a series of choices. Each one required you to ignore my trust." He looked away. "I didn't think you'd do this." "That's the problem," I replied. "You thought I'd do nothing." His voice cracked. "I'm your son." "Yes," I said, "and I was your father. That didn't stop you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I brought some of it back. I didn't take it. "How much?" I asked. 600, he muttered. "Out of how much?" He didn't answer. I stepped back and closed the door gently. Not slammed, not angrily, just closed. That night, my phone filled with messages from unknown numbers, from old acquaintances, from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some were sympathetic. Others were curious. A few were judgmental. One message stood out. From Paul Henderson, a former co-worker who'd known me for decades. "You did the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I stared at that message longer than the others, because it reminded me of something important. Standing up for yourself feels wrong when you spent your whole life standing down. The next escalation came quickly. Lucas's friends started posting vague messages online. Things about toxic parents and cutting off people who hold money over your head. Brielle shared quotes about independence and freedom. None of them mentioned me by name, but I recognized the tone immediately. Victimhood dressed up as empowerment. It would have bothered me once. Now, it just confirmed I'd made the right choice. A week later, I received a notice from the bank. The internal investigation had concluded. The withdrawal was confirmed as unauthorized use. Recovery would depend on civil proceedings. I forwarded it to Richard. That same afternoon, I received another voicemail from Lucas. This one wasn't angry or pleading. It was desperate. "Dad," he said, voice shaking, "they froze my accounts. I can't pay rent." Brielle left. I don't know what to do. I sat at my kitchen table, phone in hand, and waited for guilt to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was memory. Lucas at 6 years old, crying because he'd broken a neighbor's window with a baseball. I'd march him over, made him apologize, and had him work off the cost mowing lawns. He'd hated me for weeks, but he'd never broken another window. I pressed delete. 2 days later, Connor Blake called me. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "Mr. Whitman," he said awkwardly. I wanted to apologize." "For what?" I asked. "For laughing," he said. "For treating it like a joke. I didn't think it was that serious." "It was serious," I replied. "I know," he said quietly. "I know now." I thanked him and hung up, not because it fixed anything, but because accountability matters, even when it comes late. By the end of the month, Lucas had moved back into a friend's basement. Word traveled fast in small circles. His confidence had evaporated. His laughter had disappeared. And for the first time in his life, no one was rushing to save him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The man who raised him had finally learned how to let him fall. And sometimes, that's the hardest lesson of all. By the 4th month, the noise had shifted. Not quieter, just different. Where there had once been defiance and disbelief, there was now scrambling. Desperation has a sound to it, even when it's filtered through silence. And I could hear in the way Lucas's name kept reaching me through other people. I didn't seek out information about him. I didn't ask around. But small towns have their own way of delivering news, even to those who aren't listening. I heard he'd stopped showing up consistently at work. That Northline distribution center had cut his hours, then suspended him altogether after he missed 2 shifts without calling. I heard Brielle had left town, gone back to stay with a cousin downstate, telling anyone who'd listened that Lucas had lied about everything. I heard Connor was avoiding him now, too, embarrassed by how quickly the joke had turned into something ugly. None of it surprised me. What surprised me was how little it affected me. I woke each morning with the same quiet routine. Coffee, newspaper, a walk around the block while the air was still cool. I'd spent most of my life reacting, adjusting my mood and plans around other people's needs. Now my days belonged to me again, and the simplicity felt almost sacred. Richard called me midweek with an update. Lucas's attorney is pushing harder, he said. They're arguing emotional distress, claiming you escalated unnecessarily. I let out a short breath. Unnecessarily. I repeated. They want mediation, Richard continued. Private resolution. No further reporting. Reduce repayment. And accountability? I asked. A pause. Not in the way you define it. Then no, I said. I won't meet him. I won't negotiate. Richard hesitated. You understand this could prolong things. I understand, I replied, but I'm done shortening my spine to make things easier for him. After we hung up, I sat for a long time at the kitchen table, staring at the same spot where weeks earlier I'd nearly dropped my phone. It struck me then how much of my fear had come not from losing the money, but from realizing how easily my own son had justified taking it. The theft wasn't the deepest wound. The entitlement was. 2 days later, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. Lucas's writing. Uneven. Rushed. He didn't apologize at first. He explained. Stress. Pressure. Feeling trapped. Feeling like I'd always be okay. He wrote about how people expected things from him. How life hadn't turned out the way he thought it would. How he just wanted one good thing. Halfway through the letter, the tone changed. He started blaming. If I hadn't been so distant. If I hadn't hoarded money. If I just helped him again like before. I folded the letter before finishing it and slid it into a drawer. That letter told me everything I needed to know. He still didn't see me as a person, only as a resource that had stopped working. The next escalation came unexpectedly. I was returning from the hardware store when I noticed a car parked across the street from my house. Engine running. Windows tinted. It didn't move when I pulled into my driveway. I sat in my car and waited. After a minute, the car pulled away. It could have been coincidence. But at my age, you learn to trust patterns more than excuses. That night, I installed the old security camera I'd never bothered setting up before. I locked doors I used to leave open. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. The world hadn't changed. My awareness had. The following afternoon, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I answered. Dad, Lucas said. His voice sounded thinner than I remembered. Please don't hang up. I didn't speak. They're saying I could be charged, he continued. I didn't think it would go there. I swear I didn't. Silence again. I just need help, he said quietly. Just this once. There it was, the phrase he'd grown up on, the one that had always worked. I finally spoke. I helped you your whole life, I said, and it taught you nothing except how to take. He began to cry, loud, gasping sobs that once would have shattered me. Now, they didn't move me at all. I'm not abandoning you, I continued calmly. I'm stepping back. There's a difference. You're ruining my life, he choked. No, I replied. You're living it. I hung up. That night, I slept without waking once. The next morning, I met Frank Miller, my neighbor, while taking out the trash. He'd lived 2 houses down for years. Quiet man. Observant. I heard some things, he said carefully. About your boy. I nodded. Most people have. He studied me for a moment. You okay? I considered the question. I'm better than okay, I said. I'm honest. He smiled faintly. Took me a long time to learn that word mattered more than happy. Over the next week, the pressure increased. Emails from Lucas's attorney. Messages forwarded through relatives. One cousin even suggested I was teaching him a lesson too late. I ignored them all. Late lessons still count. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in gold, I sat on my porch and thought about fatherhood, about how often we confuse love with protection, how we shield our children from consequences, believing we're sparing them pain, when all we're doing is postponing it. Lucas had postponed his long enough. By the end of the month, the formal notice arrived. Charges were being considered. Not guaranteed, but possible. I read the letter once, then placed it back in the envelope. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to sadness, not for him, but for the years I'd lost believing silence was strength. But regret, I'd learned, is only useful if it teaches you something. And it had. I stood, locked the door, and turned off the lights. Whatever came next, I would face it standing upright. Not as a wallet, not as a shield, but as a man who finally understood that love without limits isn't love at all. By the 5th month, the truth had settled into every corner of my life. Not like dust, but like weight. The kind you feel in your knees when you stand up too fast, or in your chest when you realize something can't be undone. The chaos had slowed, but the consequences were still unfolding piece by piece, and now they were no longer theoretical. They were real, tangible, unavoidable. Lucas didn't call anymore, not directly. Instead, the messages came through other people. A cousin I barely spoke to left a voicemail telling me I was being too harsh. An old family friend sent an email reminding me that boys make mistakes. Even a former co-worker, someone I hadn't seen in years, ran into me at the grocery store and awkwardly suggested I find in my heart to let this go. I nodded politely. I said nothing, because every one of them missed the point in exactly the same way Lucas had. This wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. Richard Monroe called late one afternoon. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before. "We've reached a turning point," he said. "The financial unit is recommending charges unless restitution is made in full within a very short window." "How short?" I asked. 10 days. I closed my eyes. 10 days. That was all that stood between Lucas and something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Has he responded? I asked. Richard hesitated. Not with money, with arguments. That tracked. After we hung up, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the same framed photo that had sat on my shelf for years. Lucas at 18, graduation cap crooked, arms slung around my shoulder. I looked proud in that picture. So, did he? I wonder when that version of us had slipped away. That evening, there was a knock at my door. Not a light one. Not hesitant. Firm. Deliberate. I didn't open it right away. I looked through the peephole. It was Eleanor, Lucas's aunt, my sister-in-law. She'd always been the peacemaker, the one who believed every conflict could be smoothed over with the right words. I opened the door, but didn't step aside. "Harold," she said softly, "can I come in?" "No," I replied, "but you can talk." Her face tightened for just a second before she nodded. "I spoke to Lucas today," she began. "He's not doing well." "I know." "He's scared," she continued. "He's saying you've turned your back on him." I met her eyes. I didn't turn my back. I stepped out of the way. She sighed. "He says he made a mistake." "No," I corrected gently. "He made a choice. Then he defended it. Then he laughed." She looked down at her hands. "He's your son." "Yes," I said, "and I'm his father." That didn't stop him. Silence stretched between us. "He doesn't have the money," she said finally. "Not all of it." "That's not my problem," I replied. It became as the moment he took what wasn't his. She studied me then, really studied me, as if seeing me for the first time. "You've changed," she said. "I've stopped disappearing," I answered. She left without another word. 2 days later, Lucas tried again. This time he didn't call. He came to the house. I was in the kitchen when I heard the knock. Same firmness, same entitlement. I didn't answer. The knock came again. Then his voice. "Dad, I know you're home." I stayed where I was. "Please," he said louder now. "We need to talk. They're saying things could get really bad." I felt my jaw tighten. "They're already bad," I said through the door. "They don't have to be," he shouted. "You can stop this." I walked to the door and stood on the other side of it. "You could have stopped it," I said calmly. "At any point." There was a pause. Then his voice dropped. I didn't think you'd choose this. I rested my forehead briefly against the doorframe. I didn't choose this, I said. You did. He pounded the door once, hard. You're enjoying this, he snapped. You like watching me fall. That accusation cut deeper than anything else he'd said. I opened the door then, just enough to look him in the eye. I am not enjoying this, I said quietly, but I'm no longer afraid of it. He stared at me, breathing hard, eyes red. For a moment, I thought he might say something honest, something real. Instead, he laughed bitterly. You think you're teaching me a lesson? He said. All you're doing is proving you never cared. Something inside me went very still. I cared enough to raise you, I said. I cared enough to give you chances. I cared enough to believe you were better than this. I stepped back and closed the door. That night, the voicemail came. It was long, rambling, angry at first, then desperate, then incoherent. He accused me of ruining his life, of choosing money over family, of abandoning him when he needed me most. Near the end, his voice cracked. I don't know how to fix this, he whispered. I sat there, phone in hand, listening to the silence after the message ended. Neither did I. The next morning, Richard called again. Lucas's accounts are frozen, he said. His landlord has filed a notice. He's reached out to multiple people trying to borrow money. Has he returned anything? I asked. $700, Richard replied, through a third party. I nodded. Not enough. No, Richard agreed, but it shows panic. That afternoon, I took a walk I hadn't planned, past the old park where Lucas learned to ride a bike, past the school where I'd watched him perform in his first play. Memories rose uninvited, sharp and heavy. I realized then that this wasn't just about teaching him responsibility. It was about grieving the son I thought I had. By the end of the week, the 10-day window was nearly closed. I received one final message from Lucas. Not a voicemail, not a call, a text. If you do this, don't expect me to ever forgive you. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back, forgiveness doesn't come from avoiding consequences. It comes from taking responsibility. I turned off my phone. That night, as I lay in bed, I didn't sleep much. Not from fear, but from reflection. I thought about all the years I confused love with leniency, about how often I protected Lucas from the discomfort that teaches people who they are. I understood now that boundaries don't end relationships. Illusions do. And whatever came next, charges, courtrooms, fallout, I would face it with my eyes open. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't choosing peace at the cost of my self-respect. I was choosing truth. And truth, even when it hurts, has a way of standing firm when everything else collapses. By the 6th month, everything had slowed to a strange, heavy crawl. Like the moment after a storm when the wind has died, but the damage is still being counted. The frantic calls had stopped. The surprise visits had ended. Even the second-hand messages through relatives had dried up. What remained was the aftermath, stretching long and quiet, demanding to be lived with. Richard called early one morning. I could hear it in his voice before he said anything. It's moving forward, he told me. The recommendation has been accepted. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once balanced bills and grocery lists, and felt proud of keeping things together. So that's it, I said. It doesn't mean immediate arrest, Richard clarified, but it does mean formal proceedings. He'll be summoned. There will be conditions. I thanked him and ended the call. For a long time, I didn't move. I expected to feel something sharp, relief, maybe, or guilt, or even a flash of triumph. Instead, what settled over me was a deep bone-level fatigue. Not from the situation itself, but from the years that had led here. Years of smoothing things over. Years of telling myself it was easier not to rock the boat. Years of believing that being needed was the same as being loved. That illusion was finally gone. 2 days later, I saw Lucas again. I hadn't planned to. I wasn't even thinking about him. I was at the hardware store, standing in line with a box of screws and a replacement latch, when I felt that familiar tightening between my shoulders, the instinct that tells you someone important is nearby. I turned. He stood 3 people back, thinner than I remembered, eyes hollow, jaw clenched. He looked older than his years now, like life had rushed ahead and left behind. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he stepped out of line and walked toward me. I didn't stop him. "Dad," he said quietly, not angry, not pleading, just tired. "Lucas," I replied. We stood there, surrounded by shelves of tools and strangers who had no idea they were witnessing the remains of something once sacred. "I heard," he said. I nodded. "I assumed you would." "They're serious," he continued. "This isn't like before." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." He swallowed. "I didn't think you'd really let it happen." I studied him then. Not the boy I raised, not the man I'd hoped he'd become, but the person standing in front of me now. "I didn't make it happen," I said evenly. I stopped stopping it. That landed harder than any raised voice ever could. He looked away. "Brielle's gone," he said, as if that explained something. "Friends, too. Everyone's acting like I'm some kind of monster." I didn't respond. "They don't see how hard it's been," he added. How stuck I felt. I finally spoke. "Feeling stuck doesn't give you the right to take from someone else." His shoulders sagged. "I know." It was the first time he'd said that without an excuse following it. "I'm trying to get the rest of the money," he said. "I sold my console. Picked up night shift when I can. It's not enough, but—" "Stop," I said gently. He froze. "This isn't negotiation," I continued. "And it isn't about proving effort. It's about accepting consequences." He nodded slowly. "You always say that." "Yes," I said, "and you never listened." There was nothing more to say. We parted without anger, without resolution. Just 2 people walking in opposite directions, carrying different versions of the same history. That night, I dreamed of Lucas as a child, laughing, running, asking questions about everything. I woke with my chest tight and my eyes wet. And for the first time since this began, I let myself mourn openly, not the situation, but the relationship I believed in. Grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like letting go of hope. The following weeks were quiet, uncomfortably so. The kind of quiet that gives your thoughts too much room to wander. I filled my days with routine. I volunteered twice a week at the community center, helping other retirees with paperwork and basic budgeting. I fixed small things around the house. I read books I put off for years. And slowly, something unexpected happened. I began to feel lighter. Not because things were resolved, they weren't, but because I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's choices anymore. Then the voicemail started. Not angry ones. Not manipulative ones. Panicked ones. Lucas called late at night, his voice shaking, words tumbling over each other. He talked about court dates, conditions, paperwork he didn't understand, about how everyone looked at him differently now, about how he didn't know who he was without someone bailing him out. I listened to them once. Then I stopped, not because I didn't care, but because caring didn't mean absorbing his fear. One voicemail, in particular, stayed with me. "Dad," he said, voice breaking. "I don't think I ever learned how to stand on my own. I think I thought you'd always be there." I closed my eyes. That was the truth. And the cost of that truth was being paid now. Richard updated me again near the end of the month. The process was grinding forward. There would be restitution plans, mandatory counseling, a record that would follow Lucas for years. "He's not handling it well," Richard said carefully, "but he's handling it." That distinction mattered. Handling it didn't mean liking it. It meant surviving it. One evening, Frank Miller came by with 2 beers and sat with me on the porch. We watched the sun dip behind the houses, turning the street gold. "You holding up?" he asked. "I am," I said honestly. He nodded. "Hard thing, what you did." "Yes," I replied. "Necessary thing, too," he added. I took a sip of my beer. "I wish I'd done it sooner." He didn't disagree. As autumn edged closer, I found myself thinking less about Lucas and more about myself, about the years I had left and how I wanted to live them, not as a backup plan, not as an emotional safety net, but as a man who knew his worth. I realized then that this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning I'd been too afraid to start before. Lucas would face what he'd set in motion. I couldn't shield him from that anymore, and I wouldn't. And for the first time since becoming a father, I understood something clearly and without guilt. Loving someone doesn't mean standing between them and reality. Sometimes love steps aside and lets reality do the teaching. By the end of the 6th month, the worst had already happened. Now, all that remained was what we chose to build from the wreckage, and I was finally choosing myself. By the 7th month, the story no longer felt like something that was happening to me. It felt like something I had walked through and come out the other side of, changed, quieter, and clearer than I'd ever been. The formal notice arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. Not dramatic, not cruel, just official. Paperwork outlining the conditions Lucas would have to meet. Repayment terms, mandatory counseling, restrictions that would follow him for years. Consequences written in clean, unemotional language. I read it once. Then I folded it and placed it in the same drawer where I'd kept every letter, every receipt, every reminder of what had brought us here. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was finality. That matters more than people realize. Finality means you stop rehearsing conversations in your head. It means you stop imagining different outcomes. It means the past no longer asks you to explain yourself. Lucas didn't call that week. Neither did anyone else. The silence felt different now. Not tense, not heavy. Just neutral. Like a room after furniture has been moved out. Empty, yes, but open to something new. I started filling my days with intention instead of distraction. Morning walks turned into longer routes. I joined a small woodworking group at the community center. Not because I needed company, but because I wanted connection without obligation. People who didn't know my history and didn't need to. It was refreshing. One afternoon, while sanding the edge of a small oak table I'd been working on, I realized something that stopped me cold. I trusted myself. Not in a loud, triumphant way, but in a settled one. I trusted that if something felt wrong, I wouldn't explain it away. I trusted that I wouldn't sacrifice my future to keep someone else comfortable. I trusted that I could be kind and firm at the same time. That trust felt better than forgiveness ever had. A few weeks later, I ran into Lucas one last time. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It happened at the edge of town, outside a convenience store I rarely stopped at. He was leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground like he was trying not to be seen. He looked up when I passed. "Dad," he said. I stopped. We stood there for a moment, the space between us filled with everything we'd said and everything we never would. "I'm doing what they asked," he said quietly. "The counseling, the payments." "I know," I replied. He nodded. "I wanted you to hear from me." "I hear it," I said. There was no anger in his face, no entitlement, just exhaustion and something close to humility. It didn't erase the past, but it acknowledged it. "I didn't understand what I was taking," he said. "Not really." I studied him for a long moment. "Understanding comes late sometimes," I said, "but it still counts." He swallowed. Do you think we'll ever talk again?" I didn't answer right away. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That depends on what you build from here." He nodded slowly, accepting that answer for what it was. We parted without hugs, without promises, without drama. And that was enough. That night, sitting alone in my living room, I thought about how much my life had changed in such a short time. Not because of the money, though losing it had been painful, but because of what its loss revealed. I'd spent decades confusing peace with silence, confusing love with endurance, confusing being needed with being valued. I don't make that mistake anymore. The world didn't collapse when I stopped giving endlessly. It adjusted. So did I. I sleep better now. I eat better. I laugh more easily. My shoulders don't feel permanently hunched. I no longer flinch when my phone rings. And the quiet is no longer empty. It's full of choice. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's this. You can love someone deeply and still refuse to be used by them. You can be a parent and still demand respect. You can be kind without being weak. And sometimes the bravest thing an old man could do is finally say enough. Not with anger, but with resolve. If you stayed with me through this story, do me one final favor. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment about where you're listening from and stay connected. Not because I need validation, but because stories like this remind people they're allowed to choose themselves. This chapter of my life is closed. And for the first time in a long time, the road ahead feels like mine alone.